I really want to thank William for making this possible. William and Schurston's hospitality have really been exemplary, and I've just been treated to the warmest welcome here at Marlboro, and I've been having a lovely time, so I hope that my remarks tonight will not ruin that. So I thank you all in advance for not throwing things. The topic actually that I took for tonight is really what is conservatism, just to kind of lay it out there. And in the course of answering it, I'm going to try to show you why it's a political doctrine or maybe a set of attitudes that a thoughtful person might adopt. Now, I'm not saying a thoughtful person has to adopt it or must adopt it, right? I'm not trying to evangelize. But I'm trying to elucidate, right? Why it's a set of ideas that kind of hangs together in a thoughtful sort of way. Even if by the end of the night you still agree with John Stuart Mill, who said that the conservatives are the stupid party. Maybe you'll understand the way Mill did. Mill actually sort of backed off a little bit and then maybe reloaded when he said, well, he doesn't say that conservatives are generally stupid, i.e. he disagrees with the idea that all conservatives are stupid. He merely says that stupid people themselves are generally conservative. I'm actually going to be arguing that conservatism amounts to a wise kind of ignorance. So in a half sort of way, I'll agree with John Stuart Mill. So the structure of what I'm going to do, the first part, I'm going to set out a kind of definition, or at least lay out some basic principles that I think you will recognize as really being modern and American and conservative. So I try to avoid making it all sound very nice. Right? I want to have some things people disagree with, and then try to give some reasons actually grounded in the work of Edmund Burke and the historian Michael Oakeshott, why these attitudes make a certain amount of sense and actually sort of hang together. So for this first part, let's start with the problem of definition. Just defining conservatism is a lot harder than you might think. There's a little tautology we could say. Conservatism is the disposition to conserve. Okay? That's not very helpful. And if you look through the literature on this, I'm actually teaching a course this spring on the intellectual roots of modern conservatism, and there are scads of definitions. As early as a 1954 book on conservatism in America, Clinton Rossiter kind of throws up his hands in frustration and says, it's one of the most confusing words in the glossary of political thought and oratory. And it's confusing, I think, because really what happens is in the case of the conservatives, and I think it's different from the liberal side, in the conservative side you get the political movement first, and then the ideas sort of follow on. Whereas on the liberal side, if I were going to give a talk about liberalism, there's plenty of philosophical places to readily start with a well-articulated doctrine, right? We could start with John Locke in the 17th century defending the right of property, the right of rebellion against tyranny. In the 18th century, we could look at Immanuel Kant, who you may know every year on Bastille Day held a toast, right, to the French Revolution. And he defended the universal human rights and freedom of thought. In the 19th century, we have Mill, that we heard from. In the 20th century, we have such figures as John Rawls, whose theory of justice is really a philosophical articulation of basically the principles that go into the Great Society. Right, so in liberalism, you have these theoretical philosophers who in many ways are part and parcel of the political movement we know of as liberalism. There really is no comparable canon on the other side. The conservatives have claimed, this is sort of classically conservative to do, right? They've appropriated totemic ancestors from the distant past. So sometimes you'll hear that Aristotle is a conservative, or Cicero, or St. Augustine, or St. Thomas Aquinas. In the modern period, sometimes you see figures like David Hume, Adam Smith, the Baron de Montesquieu get invoked as conservatives. But it seems to me that all of that is very much, anachronistic. It's anachronistic because none of those thinkers would have thought of themselves as conservative in opposition to some kind of movement in favor of progress. And I think the one feature that's really a constant in the political movements that go under the banner of conservatism is this opposition to some other movement under the banner of progress. And the place that really seems to begin is a book written in 1790 by Edmund Burke, who was an Irishman, a member of the British Parliament, and thought by observers at the time possibly a sympathizer of the French Revolutionary project. Early in the agitation over the American Revolution, Burke had argued for conciliation. They want freedom, plus they're ornery and they're going to be difficult to subdue, so why don't we just part amicably? So people thought he might approve of the French Revolution. Well, he didn't, and he wrote this tirade in 1790 that presciently foresees some of the worst excesses that will come and sort of preemptively opposes it. And in that work, in this defense of the English constitutional tradition against the radical project of remaking France according to a dream of liberty and equality, conservatives really look back to Burke and say, okay, he's our first guy. Now, I was tempted to just talk about Burke tonight. But I thought that would be too easy, right? Because if I just talked about Burke, you'd say, oh, you know, what a quaint, nice guy. So I really decided I would come up with a set of views that you would really recognize as belonging to modern conservatism. And so I went to the guy that I think, and I hope you'll agree, is really the font of 20th century American movement conservatism. I'm going to Barry Goldwater. And so what I'm going to do in the next couple of minutes is look at Barry Goldwater's acceptance speech from 1964 and tease out 7 themes that I think are definitive of modern American conservatism. And then in the second part, I'll connect that to Burke's argument. So here, by the way, this is the speech that's famous for probably the least conservative thing in it, right? This is the speech that's famous for the line, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. Now, in context, and if you remember, the next thing he says is moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. In context, this extremism is really meant to announce his unconditional dedication to the liberal constitutional tradition as we have it in the United States and Britain, as opposed to totalitarian communism, you know, but still it's never conservative to say extremism is a good thing. But he did. Brought down the house in the Cow Palace when he gave the speech, and it killed him publicly afterwards. So, in any case, in this speech, freedom is one of the great themes, and it's the first one I want to share with you. And here's how, this is about 3 paragraphs in. He says, "Now, my fellow Americans, the tide has been running against freedom. We must and we shall return to proven ways, not because they're old, but because they're true. We must and we shall set the tide running again in the cause of freedom. Freedom made orderly for this nation by our constitutional government. Freedom under a government limited by laws of nature and of nature's God." Now, these few lines are very rich in conservative themes. First of all, you'll notice that the freedom he defends has 2 dimensions. It's political freedom and economic freedom. And so we get our first 2 conservative commitments out of this. 20th century conservatives were anti-communists. The defense of political freedom and constitutional government against Soviet tyranny was their core, I think, commitment. And you'll see later on that I'll liken that to Burke's opposition to the Jacobinism of the French Revolution. And it's a theme that Goldwater is going to return to time and again. And I think I'll spare you some of the further Goldwater in the interest of time. The next theme, the other part of freedom, is economic freedom. Now, Goldwater actually never uses the word capitalism in his speech, but he does speak of economic freedom, and he's quite critical of the modern regulatory state, what Margaret Thatcher would sort of infamously call the nanny state. He says this: "We are a nation becalmed. We have lost the brisk pace of diversity, and the genius of individual creativity. We're plodding at a pace set by centralized planning, red tape, ruled without responsibility, and regimentation without recourse. So that's a kind of classic conservative theme, right? That the government has gotten too big, too intrusive, is stifling the market. If you notice also in that first large excerpt from Goldwater, he spoke of orderly freedom. And that's the third value I want to draw your attention to as a classically conservative theme, the importance of public order. And in fact, Goldwater, as virtually every Republican presidential candidate in the 20th century did, spoke of the menace of crime. The growing menace in our city, our country tonight, he says, to personal safety, to life, to limb and property, particularly in our great cities, is the mounting concern of every thoughtful citizen in the United States. Security from domestic violence, no less than from foreign aggression, is the most elementary and fundamental purpose of any government. So conservatives will always hit this theme. Public order is important. The fourth value is constitutional government. In many ways, it's the flip side of anti-communism, but I wanted to draw it out separately to underscore the way it figures as a conservative trope. The word democracy never appears in the speech. Conservatives often have a very ambivalent relationship to democracy. There's a kind of untrammeled radicalism to it. Instead, what Goldwater speaks about is the importance of equality of rights under law as they are secured by constitutional institutions, common law courts, right? This legal system that, in its broad outlines, has functioned in the United States for more than 2 centuries and has a long pedigree beyond that in the UK. So Goldwater says this: we Republicans see in our constitutional form of government the great framework which assures the orderly but dynamic fulfillment of the whole man as the great reason for instituting orderly government in the first place. Right? This combination of order and freedom secured by constitutional institutions. He'll celebrate the federalism that's a defining feature of American politics and the defense of local self-government that comes with that. The fifth value or commitment that Goldwater makes is the belief in an independent moral order given to us by God. You might have heard this in Goldwater's allusion to the Declaration of Independence. Remember, the freedom he pledged to work for is freedom under a government limited by laws of nature and of nature's God. That phrase appears in the Declaration of Independence, and it's a classic conservative theme. There's some law out there that we didn't make that we need to bow before. The sixth element in my definition of modern conservatism is belief in the value and importance of military strength, which is another substantial theme in Goldwater's address. It's necessary, he says, for the protection of constitutional government against external threats. And the seventh, but not the least of these themes, is patriotism. Here's Goldwater again. My fellow Republicans, he says, we do no man a service by hiding freedom's light under a bushel of mistaken humility. I seek an America proud of its past, proud of its ways, proud of its dreams, and determined actively to proclaim them. Now, I know, Goldwater knew, that liberals love their country too, but there's an intellectual strain in liberalism that sits uncomfortably with patriotism. Right? There's a kind of cosmopolitan moral standpoint that goes along with liberalism that finds patriotism a little bit discreditable, maybe slightly embarrassing. From the cosmopolitan standpoint, we should love what is good because it is good. It would make our attachment to our country conditional upon its goodness. Right? We're always standing over as a judge. And whether that's better or worse, it's not typically conservative. The conservatives have this unironic, undetached patriotism. They love the country because it's ours, because it's theirs. And You see this in Goldwater. I think you'll see this in Burkes' English patriotism, odd for an Irishman. But the constitutional government that he's a part of defines a practical excellence and is lovable in that way. The other thing that's kind of conservative, but doesn't connect well with Burke, but I'll draw your attention to it anyway. You may have noticed, actually, there's a biblical allusion in the announcement of how great America is. And that's one of the sort of scarier themes in American conservatism, too, right? He says, "We do no man a service by hiding freedom's light under a bushel of mistaken humility." There's that, the candle is not meant to be put under a bushel, but on a candle stand. It's one of the things that Jesus says right after the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount. So this linkage between, in some way, the United States and a divine mission is one of the dodgier parts of modern conservatism. But it's there in Goldwater as well. So what I hope I've shown in this first part is there are these 7 themes that I think are really characteristic of contemporary conservatism. Hopefully at least a few of them are things you find irritating and implausible. And so in this, and just to recap, the 7 were anti-communism, economic liberty, public order, constitutional government, belief in a transcendent moral order, that it's right to defend these with a strong military, and that one ought to have an unabashed, unironic, proud patriotism to bring it all together. So those are the themes, I think, that classically conservative in the American context. And now I want to try and make them a little bit more plausible to you, more persuasive, by linking them to Edmund Burke's account of his resistance to the French Revolution. And again, what I want to show is that Burke is going to reject the revolution because he's got a theory about what kind of knowledge we're able to have about politics and about the political and moral world, and how that knowledge comes to be and how it gets instantiated. And what I'm hoping to be able to do is to show you that at least when Burke applies it in his context, it makes a fair amount of sense. And then the more difficult venture here is going to be to then transfer that theory and that way of looking at politics and political knowledge to some of these 7, I was going to say divine virtues, but perhaps you'll say deadly sins. So in any case, to understand the modern conservatives' anti-communism, that's where I want to begin. Let's look at Burke's implacable, you might even say he's extreme in his repudiation, implacable hostility to the French Revolution. And as we look at Burke and his opposition to the French Revolution, bear in mind that to Barry Goldwater and his heirs in the modern American conservative movement, the Bolsheviks really just are the Jacobins, but better armed and speaking Russian. So Burke says the French Revolution is entirely new. It's the most astonishing thing, he says, that has hitherto happened in the world. And as he sees it, what you've got is a benign but ineffectual monarch in Louis XVI, who's been rebelled against with, he says, more fury, outrage, and insult than any people has ever been known to raise against the most illegal usurper or the most sanguinary tyrant. You can tell that Burke's rhetoric is kind of flashy in its day, but not exactly to our taste. It's a little Ciceronian and rotund. But why did the French rebel against the king? Well, they reject the king not because they're, it's not like Louis XVI was particularly worse than Louis XV. To the contrary, as you know, he's a reformer. Nevertheless, they have this theory, right? This theory of the universal rights of man. And it's not a terrible theory, actually. It goes like this. Because all men are, you see it in Rousseau in a certain way. Because all men are by nature free and equal, the only legitimate form of government is republican, ruled by people under law made by the people themselves. Therefore, the feudal system, the monarchy, the established church, the quirky and uneven division of provinces and laws that made up Ancien Regime France were all condemned on principle as illegitimate. Once you've said that, right, once you've decided everything is intolerable, you open the door to the next amazing thought, which is, we know what we have is terrible. Let's get rid of it. Because what we have now is so bad that what comes after is going to be better. Well, Burke says, well, how do you know it's going to be better? And that's going to be central to his resistance. Right? How do you know what you replace it with is going to be better? It's not that Burke disagrees with the revolutionaries about the value of freedom, about the value of equality before the law, about the importance of ordinary people being able to live decent, reasonably prosperous, secure, comfortable lives. Right? Burke favors that too. Burke certainly believed that there needed to be some openness to talent in a political system. After all, he's an outsider, an Irishman, a parvenu, who's never comfortable among the elite aristocratic English society in Parliament. Right? So it's important to him that these values be secured. But he rejects as madness the idea that freedom and the rule of law can spring from a revolution whose avowed aim is to just make everything new on the basis of some untried theory that looks good on paper. So here's why it's crazy, and here's the sort of theory of knowledge behind it. Burke's view, well, this is how he says it. He says the science of constructing a commonwealth, or renovating it, or reforming it, is like every other experimental science not to be taught a priori. Right? It's not knowable by first principles. You have to learn it by experience. Now, if you'll allow me to steal an argument from Michael Oakeshott's essay on rationalism and politics, the way he makes the point is this. He says we have to resist the thought that political science is something like engineering. That all you have to do is come up with good, solid principles of design that you can know, and bang, you got a machine and set it going. Rather, political institutions are works of art and skill. Knowing how to govern effectively, knowing how to set up institutions that actually accomplish the good you hope from them, takes a kind of knack, an art learned in practice. Think about, well, this is an example that I can only use to the real grown-ups in the audience, like parenthood. Right? There's no book that tells you exactly how to be a parent. Right? There is no rule that tells you how to handle the first temper tantrum, the second temper tantrum, you know, whatever it is. I mean, there are many books, but no one of those books actually can capture the full knowledge you need to do the thing well. You learn it by doing it, right? You learn it by consulting with people who've done it before you. Frantically call your parents if you think they did a good job with you and say, help, what do we do? Think about how you've learned sports or the theater or music, right? This is not reducible in any case to rules. You apprenticed, you trained with a good coach, you had a violin teacher who showed you, who helped you develop just the taste and the feel of what the right amount of vibrato sounds like. Right? There's no rule that does that in those cases. And I'd like to persuade you there's no simple set of rules in politics either. Instead, we learn the art of politics by working within the institutions that we have. And working within the institutions that we have, we can see their strengths, we can see their flaws, and if we're going to be consistent with this understanding of what we're doing, when we want to change them for the better, we're not going to want to throw everything out that would make our knowledge useless. Right? We're not going to try to improve our violin playing by deciding, I should have really started with the electric guitar. Right? Rather, we're going to work on a different modification of our technique to get it right. And so as Burke writes about government, you're going to see in his language these practical images, this theme of practical knowledge just recurring time and time again. He says, for example, The right liberties and restrictions on liberty needed to produce an orderly and free society vary with the times and circumstances. Therefore, they can't be settled upon any abstract rule. You have to work on them in progress. Now, you could do it abstractly. He says, look, to make a government, all you need to do is put all the power in one place. Tell everybody, obey that person, and then you're done. Freedom is even easier, right? You just take all the police off the street, open the jails, and wow, you're done. But if what you want to have is an orderly liberty, that's the challenge. Burke says to bring it off requires much thought, deep reflection, a sagacious, powerful, and combining mind. And his approach adds, minds that have been schooled in the practical arts of politics and government. Here, let me say in passing, we can see in Burke the same concern for public order or a well-regulated freedom that we saw in Goldwater. Chaos, crime, and civil war are terrible for everybody, but above all for the regular folks who lack the financial means to emigrate or to buy the necessities of life on the black market when the economy has broken down and civil unrest. Right? In their pride and their revolutionary ideology, the French revolutionaries don't care. They've forgotten how fragile and valuable public order is. Let's hang the bishops from the lampposts. Right? Let's riot in the streets. Let's bring ordinary life to a halt. But bringing ordinary life to a halt is A, itself very harmful to people, and B, opens the doors, in fact opened the doors to unending, well, not unending, but quite a long period of terrible, horrific violence in France. Right? In contrast to the revolutionaries who were prepared to open that door on the basis of what they were sure they knew, Burke says, we know that we have made no great discoveries. And we think that no great discoveries are to be made in morality, nor many in the great principles of government, nor in the ideas of liberty, which were long understood before we were born. And if you really think about it, if you really ask yourself, what institutional improvements have been made in the American frame of government, or the sort of general Anglo-American frame of government since the 18th century, you'll come up with very few, right? The key ones we had a long time ago. No arbitrary imprisonment, separation of powers, independent judiciary, legislative chambers responsive to open and free elections. That's the core. And we've had that for a long time. Probably the one innovation you might point to might be proportional representation, which was discovered after our Constitution got going. But very few such changes. Here, too, is where the value of a tradition of constitutional government becomes visible. The only freedom and equality that matter are not those in the books of Rousseau and Voltaire or whoever else. They're the things we can enjoy in practice under institutional guarantees. Right? You can read the constitutions of all kinds of countries. Right? All sorts of rights used to be guaranteed under the old Soviet Constitution. But you couldn't actually exercise them. And sure, you can't necessarily exercise every American constitutional right you have, but our system does a reasonably darn good job of securing them. To the extent that the art of designing or improving institutions is an art and a skill, right, it's learned by observing. And so here's what Burke insists about that observation and a way in which the conservative temperament helps. If you're going to fix a thing, you have to be prepared to see what was good about it, what its actually valuable function is. Right? You can't just sort of look at the surface and think you know it all. What are the surprising side effects that these institutions actually accomplish? So here's how Burke puts that. A man full of warm, speculative benevolence may wish his society otherwise constituted than he finds it. But a good patriot and a true politician always considers how he shall make the most of the existing materials of his country. A disposition to preserve and an ability to improve taken together, in a sense, would be my standard of a statesman. Burke knows the Constitution he's defending is imperfect. It had a hereditary king, hereditary peers, a House of Commons elected by a narrow, somewhat arbitrary franchise. He knows it's not perfect, but it did a pretty good job for the time of securing reasonably good conditions of life for the people of the United Kingdom. And if you really were to ask yourself, suppose some genie cursed you and said you're going back to 1790 and you have to live in some civilized society somewhere, but you're going to be just some schmo at the bottom of society. Britain would be a really smart choice. You could, I mean, you know, maybe the America you could light out to the west, you know, bearing in mind that this involves you expropriating the land from the natives and all of that. But, you know, it's the white man's republic. You do all right under that. But if you have to be an ordinary person, you're not going to pick Eastern Europe. You're not going to pick China, Japan. You're going to pick. At this juncture, too, we can see why Burke thinks that an unironic patriotism can be seen as the appropriate attitude of anyone living in a decent political order. What Burke wants you to see is that despite its faults, you probably live in a society, and I would say you do live in a society that protects your security, your liberty, makes possible opportunities. And you know what? You didn't make those things. Well, the 20-year-olds did. Some of the people of experience may actually have done so. But certainly, young people haven't made those things. You found them. These were gifts to you. And Burke says, you need to recognize that it was a gift. Gratitude and love are the right response when people have given you valuable things. Sure, the gifts could have been better, but that's always true, right? Instead of that, you know, 1998 Honda Civic I'm driving, Mom could have given me, you know, a new BMW. But my parents couldn't afford that, so that's what I got. And is the right attitude to the gift wishing it had been the new BMW, or do you look at the old car and say, you loved me enough to give me this. It'll get me around, thank you. Patriotism, unironic patriotism for Burke, is this kind of gratitude. Because what we have is pretty good. Be thankful. And then we saw before that reform seems to presuppose a kind of patriotic attachment. If you can't see the good in what is, you're not going to be able to reform it to make it better. You'll be ill-prepared for that and likely to throw it all away. And he specifically blames the French revolutionaries for, as he says, despising their country for its faults. Now I want to come back and connect this rejection of hubris, because that's really what the Jacobins are guilty of, according to Burke, is hubris. And I want to connect that back to Goldwater and modern American conservatism, and then get to the last couple of virtues, or perhaps vice. Goldwater's core argument against communism invokes its pretensions to knowledge, just as we would expect. Right? It's hubris. He says, those who elevate the state and downgrade the citizen must see ultimately a world in which earthly power can be substituted for divine will. And this nation was founded upon the rejection of that notion, and upon the acceptance of God as the author of freedom. Absolute power does corrupt, he says, and those who seek it must be suspect and must be opposed. Right, and here again, we're at that awkward, easily corruptible moment in conservatism, where he's right on the edge, I think, of saying, they're godless, we speak for God, we're never wrong. And to the extent that that's what he's saying, he's actually guilty of exactly the inverse of what he's accusing the Russians of. I think the way Burke would take this, and when Burke invokes a transcendent order, the point is slightly different, and it really is a point against hubris. I think we have to take Goldwater not as saying, my will is divine. I am like a god, I legislate for you. But I think he's saying, what we always need to remember is there are rules out there that we didn't make, that have to limit us. We may not actually know what God wills for us, right? But we know that somewhere out there, there's a limit that we have to run up against. And, you know, that limit is largely revealed to us through the tradition of constitutional government and the sort of traditional moral inheritance that we continue to practice from the past, right? So Burke is not saying we've made new moral discoveries. If he were saying that, I think he would be clearly guilty of hubris. And I think Goldwater isn't saying it either. But I realize this is a difficult one. I'm not going to say that much about military strength, which actually figured very little in the reflections. Burke does go on to call for resistance to the French revolutionary regime, but military strength is not his big theme. But I do want to connect it, nevertheless, in this way. It's a reasonable response, the desire for a strong armed forces, a reasonable response to the belief that the world is inherently and fundamentally dangerous. Right? To the belief that international order, like peace at home, is fragile. It's threatened when there's a vacuum. There are always people out there who want to do you harm. And the best way you can prevent them from doing harm is to be ready to meet any challenges. And I think since the whole experience of the world teaches us that the world is a bad place, that's full of oppressive regimes, the hope that if we disarm, peace would break out requires a kind of faith in an order never yet seen. So again, I want to connect humility even to this belief in the importance of military strength. But I've left out the hardest one, and this is the last of our 7 as we get toward the end, and that is free market capitalism. Burke says relatively little that would apply readily to our economic situation, although he does in passing criticize the French revolutionaries for debauching the currency and destroying the economy. But it's not in terms that we would really recognize. And again, there's a way in which you could worry that a too principled, a too doctrinaire defense of capitalism would actually end up sounding like the sort of a priorism of the Jacobins. Right? If I said, well, capitalism is right because it is right, if I started quoting Ayn Rand to you, I could very easily sound like a Jacobin. And Burke senses this, and I think even in Goldwater's defense of, again, the free economy, and not literally capitalism, the defense he's going to make, he's going to stress virtues that echo in Burke. And I think there are 3 aspects to that defense that are worth looking at. So first he says this: we see in private property, and in an economy based upon and fostering private property, the one way to make government a durable ally of the whole man, rather than his determined enemy. We see in the sanctity of private property the only durable foundation for constitutional government in a free society. In other words, here his argument is instrumental. Right? It's not an a priori truth that we have to be free to make economic transactions as we see fit. He argues rather that instrumentally, where there are private fortunes, there are independent private centers of power that are always available to limit and restrict the central government. And since overmighty governments oppressing the people have been the sort of constant threat to liberty century over century, it's a reasonable sort of claim. But again, it's an instrumental argument and not a kind of inherent argument. The second argument he makes actually is that economic liberty and freedom in the marketplace protect diversity. Right? Every time the government imposes uniformity, that's what coercively backed rules do, they impose uniformity. Right? Whenever you do that, the legislators have to be saying, well, we actually know better than you do what you should want. But how often can we truly know, when we put ourselves in the legislative seat, what is better for everyone else? Right? If people are free to purchase what they want, if they're free to start the businesses they want, provide the services that they want, right? They're responding to their practical judgments. And we're not, from the center, dictating standards that all must meet. Right? So it protects a kind of diversity. So here's how Goldwater puts it. And beyond all that, we see and cherish diversity of ways, diversity of thoughts, of motives, of accomplishments. We don't seek to live anyone's life for him. We only seek to secure his rights, guarantee him opportunity to strive, with government performing only those needed and constitutionally sanctioned tasks, which cannot otherwise be performed. So the argument here is that no one can know how the whole multiplicity of 300 million people in a big country should all flourish. Government ought to set its sights much lower. Let's secure the basic framework within which we can all do this. And that involves the preservation of a system of market liberty, constitutional liberty, and some of these other things. And lastly, he rejects equality, economic equality, as a goal of government. Equality, rightly understood as our founding fathers understood it, he says, leads to liberty and to the emancipation of creative differences. Wrongly understood, as it has been so tragically in our time, it leads first to conformity and then to despotism. Now, the argument is a little bit underdeveloped there, it's kind of an assertion. But the connection he's trying to make is that an excessively regulatory state is sort of moving you toward a world of government authority that is going to be hard to limit. And this is a theme that you see prominently in 20th century conservatives. I think Friedrich Hayek's Road to Serfdom is the most prominent example of this. The fear that once you start down the path to substantial economic regulation in the name of equality, you have no logical stopping point. And so, rather than get on a road you can't foresee the end of, you don't get on the road. In any case, what I hope I've shown in this section is that the 7 values that I identified as central to the modern view of conservatism all have their foundation, if you will, in certain arguments that Burke had made about the little we can know about politics and how respectful we have to be of the craft knowledge inherent in it. And so finally, I just want to end with Mill. What I think I've shown, I hope I've shown, is not that conservatives are dumb or stupid. In fact, right, they're not the stupid party, maybe they're the ignorant party. But, you know, as Plato's Socrates says in the Apology, well, probably we're all ignorant, but there's a certain wisdom in knowing what you don't know. And so I guess I'm going to claim for the conservatives the wisdom of knowing how little they really know. And so I'll end there and take some questions.
Thanks for that, Joe. And I wonder, going back to Goldwater.
Yeah.
So, especially the way you've laid out the connections with Burke, and seem like more and more of a sympathetic person. Particularly the way you were discussing the using economic liberty. And I wasn't sure at the moment whether you were quoting Burke or whether you were quoting Goldwater, but this idea of emancipation of creative forces and allowing diversity. So Goldwater uses this term diversity.
He does.
And in that sense, it sounds like, oh, this is this opportunity for a lot of experimentation, trying things out, small businesses we could think about, entrepreneurship. So then, to hold that thought and that understanding of diversity in the conservative framework, and then the social conservatism, which seemed to have dominated public discourse around the conservative is the person who makes claims about norms and how people should live. So it seems to have inverted. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that. Was Goldwater then superseded by other forms of more intolerant social norms?
So you sort of caught me out here, right? So the advantage of picking Goldwater, he's got this actually social libertarian side that left out of our equation, except in the intimation of the identification of America with kind of God's will. And he doesn't actually say that, right? There's just this illusion that someone could hint at. You ask, where's the place of the social conservatives? basically they see themselves as constantly on the defensive. And so the place where social conservatism fits in is they're the people who still believe what your grandmother believed. And to the extent that they sound strident, it's because they feel themselves like suddenly there are all these voices raised against them saying, grandma was wrong. And, the truth is, I think we could have an interesting conversation about, which parts of the social conservative program, made sense and don't. I mean, certain, they end up standing athwart, right, the whole heritage of the 1960s in an undifferentiated way, saying, we don't like any of it. And even as they're saying that, though, you have all these prominent conservatives, a guy like Newt Gingrich, who's now, by all accounts, a very devout conservative Catholic, is a devout conservative Catholic with his third wife. And that's, right, that if you're a devout conservative Catholic, that's an odd place to be. It's all, I think his conversion happened maybe afterwards. But, it's how they've accommodated themselves to that. It is sort of, I think there's some interesting sociological work and empirical work looking at the sort of legacy of the, is it good to live in a world where so many children are born out of wedlock? Some fairly persuasive evidence that suggests that's very bad for many children. Fragility of marriages seems to be bad for many people. So there's some aspects of the social conservative resistance to change that may have been borne out by evidence. Now, it's the ironic fact of the conservative position is they say, well, you shouldn't have children out of wedlock because that's what grandma said. And they never had arguments and evidence, and so when the children of the 60s said, well, why shouldn't we? And the conservatives said, because grandma said so, it was unpersuasive. And we have these changes that have not all been good, even as they have been liberating. The debate over marriage, though, is a very interesting one. And there is an interesting conservative strand. It's not the dominant aspect of the debate about marriage, but, there is a conservative argument. I think this was Andrew Sullivan's argument, that marriage makes people boring, right? You want people to not have sex, let them get married and have a mortgage. And if conservatives want gays to be boring, they should favor gay marriage. And there's a lot that a conservative has to like in that argument. And, again, there are, it's certainly, I think, David Burkes' position. But, to the extent that there's also this strand of religious people who feel themselves embattled, their response is to take the maximalist, hardest view of their position and just shove it out there. And I think if any time we feel ourselves doing that, whatever the view is, if you feel you're the only person who has, if you're ever at dinner with all your conservative relatives and they start going off, suddenly you just take a position far beyond what you ordinarily would just take. Right? I think that's what social conservatives to some extent are. And it's, you don't have to agree with them. But I understand, I think that's where they're often coming from. And they have their share of terrible people too, I suppose, but not all of them.
My question is, you talked about there being, I guess, as I understood, too many rules, kind of?
Oh, the modern economy, yeah.
Right, too much regulation. But then also talked about public order.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the conservative take on how to balance those two things?
Well, see, this is the...
Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry, I thought you were done.
No, just maintaining public order versus, lifting regulations to...
But there's no good answer, right? And seriously, the Burkean has to say that it's a judgment call. It is the consistent Burkean answer, that sometimes rules are going to be merely meddlesome interferences with liberty. Or worse, they're going to be, in effect, subsidies to powerful people who lobby to get the rules put in place, and in practice do more harm than good. And obviously there are plenty of rules that are necessary, right? there are doctrinaire libertarians who say that you could dispense with the whole regulatory state and just have a really, really robust system of tort liability. So that, if you could say, I've got some asthma, and you could find all the various polluters, you could bring an action in tort against the polluters, and thus, simply by using the civil law, bring about the same results that the regulatory state does. A big disadvantage of their position is they can't actually show any place where it's actually worked that way. And so, the conservatives have to be open to finding some balance between, what are the minimum set of rules that actually secure these goods that we're talking about? Because what Burke is trying to look at, and I think even Goldwater too, is that we all have a picture in our head of what good, ordinary lives are like. And the trick is to find the framework of rules that allow us to sort of go about and do what we can and lead those lives. But you can't know in the abstract sense which ones work and which ones don't, right? If we made you dictator tomorrow, you'd have to spend the next 5 years figuring out what's going on before you could change anything. And I think that's the sense that Burke has. And maybe in Goldwater.
It seems to me that when you, on the one hand, say that we have to pay attention to what is and recognize its value if we're going to make a change, and then don't really talk about how you go about making those changes and what it is that entitles you to make those changes. And to put this in a particular context, I'm not even going to touch the military for the moment, but in the particular context of the economy, and given our recent experience, that sacredness of private property that has enabled gigantic corporations which have more power than most countries and have no particular loyalty to this country and who manage to absorb huge amounts of our taxes and are continuing to absorb huge amounts through the Federal Reserve subsidies. All of those things are things which I would like to tinker with. And I see resistance to tinkering with them from people who call themselves conservatives.
Well, it's a great point. And there's resistance to tinkering, on both sides of this. The Democratic coalition now includes a lot of the Wall Street crowd. And I think that's a fair
grant you. I don't think they're
I think the real
in this respect.
No, I think that's a fair point. This is one of these times where I wish I were an economist to have this sort of, definitive good answer to what the appropriate policy solution is. I think the conservative side of this would point out the ways in which government policies themselves are at fault, and the way in which sort of well-meaning governmental activities, create a sort of moral hazard. As you point out, the very low rates of interest the Federal Reserve is charging the large banks now, so that in effect they can have a wider spread on the commercial loans they write, so they can revive their balance sheets, right? That's in effect
Well,
a
they
subsidy.
can actually take money out of the Federal Reserve and buy federal bonds.
Yeah, that's right. They can directly
arbitrage.
arbitrage, and it's even
You
worse
and
than
I can do it.
No, that's right. We don't have access to the Fed window. But what do we do about that? And the conservatives say, all right, well, we have to, this is maybe a place where the libertarians have more to say. That they sort of worry, well, when you have, essentially large amounts of discretionary governmental power, which is what the Fed is, that's the condition when it's most likely to be abused. And to the extent that governmental power can be chained down to laws that would apply more universally, that we get rid of the situation where these favored entities are given a deal that is inaccessible to you and to me, that if you can get rid of that, that would improve things. And so I think that's an intuition that you find in this tradition that's a useful one, for what it's worth.
I'm sorry, but I don't want to monopolize things.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
I'm interested in the locus of power that's represented by the corporations and the necessity to have some countervailing opportunity. We don't have a vote in a corporation. We don't have a vote in the oil companies. We have some vote in the federal government, or did until Citizens United. And
But it didn't change your votes.
well, changed a lot of people's votes.
The Democrats outspent the Republicans in the last election by a good measure, in loss, even counting in the independent corporate expenditures. But, you know, on the corporate side, I mean, there's two aspects of it which aren't, I think, as dire maybe as all that. One is, you know, among the largest shareholders are very large public pension funds, right? That have been pressing for more their own representation on the boards of these corporations. So, I mean, that's a place where, in fact, ownership in these things is widely dispersed. That's a vehicle for bringing about change. And the other is, I think one should never underestimate that at the end of the day in our system, the power of a mobilized political electoral majority, right, that's unstoppable. And, you know, one of the sort of brute realities of our situation is that the center of gravity of the political system we have is either, you know, not with the Progressive Coalition or even possibly center-right. And it's an artifact, I mean, it's just a problem of political persuasion and mobilization, if you want to say it that way. Right? Don't despair, be a political entrepreneur, and you could yet win. I mean, that's the only answer I think there is.